We've got about 170 or slightly more on the call, which is great, and that level of interest across our areas is very welcome. And we've got colleagues from councils, NHS trusts, primary care, healthcare commissioners, housing associations, voluntary social and faith sector organisations, research and academia, Healthwatch, NHSEI, and if there's any constituency or organisation I've not mentioned there, please do use the chat to bring that to our attention to make sure we acknowledge your contribution and that it's not overlooked. I say that range of people to emphasise the diversity of our meeting and the inclusion of our meeting, because I think that's really important, but also to make it plain that our purpose today is to bring those diverse contributions together in a coherent way for the public we serve, and that's the point of the Health and Care Partnership, I think. And I would say from our previous Assembly meeting in September, where the emphasis was on place, that need for coherence, that benefit of coherence is never more true than in place or borough or city, whatever language we choose to use to describe our particular place. And at the last Assembly in September, we focused on place, and that was on the basis of a situation in which practical integration occurred. And I think at that meeting, we established unequivocally that this was the way we planned to work, that our default was always to place if we had a choice and if it was justified, and that was our preferred way of working. And happily, the recently published white paper supports that emphasis and reinforces that emphasis, so will help us along the way. And place, we emphasise place as being our way of servicing the public better. And this Assembly meeting is determined to look at what we do with that way. What are our objects? What are we trying to achieve? What's the purpose? The partnership was established to attend to 4 key priorities. First, improving population health. Second, reducing inequalities. Third, improving the quality and increasing the value of care. And fourth, ensuring the NHS plays its part in contributing social value. Next slide, if you would. This Assembly meeting is dedicated to the second of those priorities, reducing inequalities, and it's fundamental to the mission of the partnership. The statutory members of the partnership are being asked to sign up to a memorandum of understanding between the statutory members at the moment, where it's clear that the mission of the partnership, as stated here, is to tackle health inequalities and improve the lives of the poorest fastest, and that we believe we can do this by working together in partnership. So we've established that working to reduce inequalities is central to what the partnership is about, and the number of people I talk to who hold that dear, it's a fundamental value that we hold, that we wish to do more about tackling inequalities, and therefore that's what this Partnership Assembly is dedicated to. So if you just allow me for a couple of minutes to provide a little context for our inequalities work. And again, next slide, please. Because this year is a year of transition, I think, certainly for Cheshire and Merseyside Health and Care Partnership. And that's not only determined by the government's white paper, innovation and integration, though I think it helps us on the way enormously. But if we look at the intrinsic nature of our work, then improving our integration efforts, providing partnership approaches for public benefit is something that we need to increase and deepen, I think. One of those transitions is from an SDP to an ICS. Let me unpack a bit of that language there. I think there's a 2-stage transition. At the moment, the Health and Care Partnership is an SDP, a Sustainability and Transformation Partnership. And we need to move to the first form of integrated care system, an ICS. Now, it has to be said that many areas of countries are already ICSs, and Cheshire and Merseyside has been off the pace and has not achieved that status. But I'm hopeful that in the very near future, in the next couple of weeks, we will hear that Cheshire and Merseyside has achieved that ICS status. But if you like, that's the old ICS status. What the white paper proposes is that ICSs will be established from the 1st of April 2022 on a statutory basis, and that NHS commissioning for Cheshire and Merseyside will become that organisation's responsibility from then. And it will also retain the responsibility for bringing together partners who contribute to health and care to enable the integration approach to flourish. And it will take a considerable amount of work to deliver that well. And we want everyone to be able to contribute to that development. So particularly if you're feeling disengaged about that move, particularly towards statutory ICS by 2022, again, use the chat box and let us know your constituency, and we will try and help you navigate into the discussions that are taking place at the moment, because it's really important to us that it's an inclusive exercise, that we develop this together and we own it collectively. I described earlier our commitment to place-based approaches, and just in establishing an ICS, a statutory ICS, will be a challenge. And there is much good work happening in places to establish how integrated approaches can enable good stewardship, and that will need to develop. I think we have many good examples of how integration and partnership benefit the people of Cheshire and Merseyside, and this pandemic has lowered boundaries between our constituents organisations, I think, for very significant public benefit. But we need to do more work within localities as well, within our places, to enable those places to be able to fulfil the roles that are starting to be described, the collective roles, the way we work together, and work together in place, a fundamental thing that we established at the last partnership board. And of course, we need good governance. When £4.4 billion worth of public money will come through the conduit of the ICS, we need to be sure that every part of good stewardship is applied. It will be one of the challenges for the ICS that its mission will be to support and enable partnership and be the responsible body for a significant sum of NHS money. And there's a little bit of a paradox in there that we're going to have to be careful to explore and understand and work through. We will find, though, that however well we developed our structures, I think, my experience tells me that in itself will not be sufficient. We must have good structures, good governance, but it won't be sufficient. And the road to true partnership will rely in part on the quality of the relationships we develop. And that's one of the fundamental purposes of our assembly meetings, that collectively we share ambitions and understand a sense of direction. And that makes it easier for us to align behind that sense of direction, those ambitions. And I think as we work together, we trust each other more. And that brings me on to the last point on these slides, and it gives me an opportunity to thank our speakers today. I really appreciate our speakers volunteering to be involved in this. And whilst I don't hold the view that outside help isn't valuable, I do hold the view that we have exceptionally talented, effective people in our patch. It illustrates that the partnership isn't a few people in an office in Liverpool. It's all of us, committed, value-driven, purposeful, and if I may say so, generally fabulous people. I think we have massive talent for the things we are trying to tackle now, and our speakers will show us what's being done and what more can be done. So thank you to Chris, Louise, Tony and Joe for taking the time out to provide us what I hope will be interesting and illustrative ideas about the kind of work we're all collectively involved in. And once we've done listening, we will all have an opportunity in our place groups to contribute to how we can make a bigger difference to tackling inequalities, this important agenda. So thank you very much for coming. Very much welcome. Look forward both to the presentations and the discussions that we have. Thank you for your commitment to this work as well. I'm going to hand over to Robert Rowland-Smith now, who is our facilitator for the afternoon, and his work is to make our work easier. So over to you, Robert.
Thanks very much indeed, Alan, and welcome to everybody. It's very good to see you all. Izzy, if I could have the next slide, please, that would be great. And you'll hear me and other speakers just occasionally mentioning the name of Izzy. Izzy Coombs is our technical director in the background, and I've noticed one or two people in the chat saying there might be some sound issues, so we'll try and work on those in the background. I'm just going to very quickly take you through the agenda and ground rules for this afternoon, very straightforward. As Alan's already mentioned, we have a wonderful set of speakers giving presentations and remarks today. So Chris Bentley, Professor Chris Bentley will be the first of those. Councillor Louise Gittins will follow, and we're lucky also to have Chief Executive of Liverpool City Council, Tony Reeves, offering his perspective too. Once we've heard from those three, we'll have a kind of de facto panel essentially made up of those three, where I'll pick some questions out of the chat for them to respond to. And then we go into our breakout groups, which will be based around those 9 places. As Alan said in his intro, this assembly is very much building on the work of the first one, which was around place-based approaches to transformation. And in particular today, this is about place-based approaches to reducing health inequalities. During those breakout groups, I'll be picking up some of the feedback via a separate WhatsApp channel, and then feeding that back into the main room once we're regathered for Jackie Benny, the Chief Officer of the Partnership Executive, to reflect on. We'll finish with Joe Rafferty, the Chief Exec of Merseycare, giving us some insights into the kind of work he's doing in order to produce kind of data-driven solutions to some of these questions, before we finish with an open discussion. And then, Alan, I'll hand back to you to close the meeting. Just quickly on ground rules, Izzy, if I could have this slide on ground rules. You'll see we're on Microsoft Teams rather than Zoom, and that's because of enhanced security. If we do have a kind of nuclear meltdown today and it all goes horribly wrong, we'll email you a new link immediately for you to get back onto the meeting, and with that we'll be able to pick up again smoothly, but touch wood that doesn't happen. You'll have noticed the event is being recorded, so it's an open meeting, a public meeting, and that will be for other stakeholders to be able to review the events afterwards, and for you if you wish to look back. I'm sure you're all familiar with this kind of protocol now. We'll keep the microphones and video off as a default, unless of course you're invited to contribute, and at that point Izzy, who has the kind of master controls, will be able to unmute you and turn your video on. So if you do have comments and questions, please put them there in the chat box. That's going to be our principal method then for interchange with this wider group. Clearly, we've already got 127 people on the meeting. With that many people, we can't manage live voice so easily. So we will be using that meeting chat if you can. And again, I'm sure you'll be familiar with this. We've not scheduled a break. Most of you will be, many of you at least, will be working from home, so you can make the choice of when to step out if you need to. I hope that's all clear. I am going to, if that's okay, then hand over to you, Professor Chris Bentley, and you're going to be taking us through kind of place-based approaches to inequalities. And just a final reminder, if you're interested, before Chris joins us, on following our social media accounts, Izzy, you can just bring up, if you like, the next slide, which just reminds you of what the social media hashtags and handles are for the meeting. So without further ado, Chris, I'm going to hand over to you, and we will check back in with you in a few minutes. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks very much. I'm delighted to be here. Good afternoon, everybody. Health inequalities is my particular interest. I'm a population health consultant, and that's been my sort of driving force for a while now. I think Izzy's going to hand over control of my slides. There we go. Yeah, so I in that role of health inequalities consultant, I had the privilege of heading up a national team called Health Inequalities National Support Team back in the late 2000s, when there was a national strategy to address health inequalities. And that gave me the opportunity with my team to sort of visit all of the areas who were the sort of target 20% of the population, and we were trying to narrow the gap in inequality and mortality between them and the national average. That was a huge learning experience. We got around all of the 70 areas, quite a number of them in Cheshire and Merseyside now, of course. There was a huge amount of experiential learning there. And I've spent the next set of years working at sort of national, regional, local level, trying to keep the learning alive and translating it through into the new contexts. That's absolutely true today. I've got another claim to being here as well, which is that I'm now a non-executive on the patch and in the Wirral Community and Care Trust. I have to say I'm speaking on behalf of myself and not for them in this particular area, although I know I'm in tune with them on lots of these issues. So I always start really with this slide, which basically draws together in a quite simple way for me the various components of health inequalities. You can see here these blocks, the bottom left-hand one here, risk conditions, poverty, unemployment, discrimination, and those are the wider determinants. And these lead into the individual problems of psychosocial risks like isolation, poor self-esteem, loss of meaning, purpose in life. Those together combine to enable to influence the choices that people make in their behaviours, even though they may be damaging to their health. They help them get through difficult days or lives without much hope. And those things all together combine to do these things to your bodies. They affect your physiology in ways that create the problems, such as the diseases. They're commonplace diseases. There's no special diseases of poverty or discrimination. They're the usual suspects. Now, when we start talking about these things and how to get in amongst them, people start talking about prevention, immediately go to thinking about behavioural risks. But of course, when you look at this diagram, prevention can actually and should occur at any of these points in the diagram. And that, of course, brings in all our partners to be components of the actions that we need to take. I would say that it's not a path really that's straightforward, where you actually say, oh, we'll reduce poverty and that will influence people's self-esteem. They won't be drinking so much and therefore blood pressures won't be such a big problem, or strokes. It's not going to be like that. And I think the issue is, and as we hear here, the various components of the deprivation are captured in this index of multiple deprivation, these 7 components, which you'll recognise as important parts of that. What's happening is that for any given place, the deprivation score means that whatever intervention you're trying to bring in there, whether it be health or social care or whatever, you're going to have to take into account all those pressures and complexities that people living in those areas are actually really working with. And I'm talking mainly about multiple deprivation, but I must just remind us that ethnicity is very closely associated with deprivation. And as you can see here, the most deprived 10%, 20% of the population over here is where a lot of people in ethnic minority groups are from. Now, of course, I'm not going to be talking much about COVID, but just for a change, but it was very clear. It was entrenched before, and I was seeing that obviously for many years, but COVID has made it seem so that it's never been clearer. And the issues that I was seeing as background vulnerability before COVID arrived really were going to make it clear that those areas were going to have compromised ability to respond, having less strength and resilience than many others. But it's not going to stop there, and I'm afraid as we come out of COVID, the impact of the epidemic and its control measures are probably going to see the tendency for widening disadvantage going forward. Now, the Health Inequalities team, when we were looking at how we intervene to actually change the inequalities issues at the time, we came up with this triangle, which has stuck with me the whole way through. It's shown itself to have value. And there are these 3 component parts, all of which could make a percentage change at population level. The first one is civic level things, legislation, regulation, taxation, welfare and benefits, things that are done at town hall, city hall, and actually should actually impact across the whole populations. Then over here, we've got communities themselves, and we're looking at how their assets and their leadership and their networks can actually help individuals living in those communities to help their own health and well-being. And be supported to do so. And then finally here we've got the impact of services, and particularly we're talking here about health services, and we're looking to make sure that the evidence-based work is actually being consistently delivered. We're trying to drive away the unwarranted variation in delivery quality, but we're also going to look at unwarranted variation in the way the population uses those services and are supported to use those services. Now, each of those can on their own make an impact on inequalities and other population measures, but how much better if we can actually combine them together in a coherent way, and that way additively place-based planning is going to really get the most out of those inputs. And you can actually move with the color coding from that diagram beforehand. You can see that there are things that each of those sectors can be doing that will complement the things that the other sectors are doing. And all of that together can really make such a major impact. And you can do the same sort of slides for anything you think of. This is Child Best Start. I've got similar ones for managing high blood pressure or for tobacco control. If we can add them all together, that's great. But what about the interfaces? Now, I call these interfaces the seams. The reason for that is people talk about seamless, but I know from haute couture, fancy fashion, they say, oh, no, we spend all our time on the seams because that's how you get the best function and shape for your garments. And I like that. And I think that if we think about putting a lot of our effort into the seams, that should help us to get the best shape for our garment. Now, I'm just going to talk a bit about the burden of disease that you see within populations. And you can see here with the most deprived 10% on the left and the least on the right, how much the mortality changes. It's not a straight line, it's a curving upwards line into the most deprived quintile. That's in terms of deaths. But it's true of the illness and morbidity. Here's mental health and substance misuse here. Bottom is the most deprived 20% of a population. You can see the curve again. And here we've got cirrhosis, alcohol harm causing most of this. And you can see there's actually a step down between the most deprived 40% and the rest. And then this is one of the long-term conditions, COPD, respiratory disease. So what impact's that going to have on services? Well, we can see here, each of the coloured lines that's shown on this chart represents one of the 20% of deprivation from least to most. And you can see compared to least is actually that solid black line. And you can see here that for elective care, there's very little difference. How on earth can that be true? I've just shown you the extent to which the burden of disease really focuses in on the most deprived areas. So why haven't they got more of a representation, if you like, within elective care? But if you actually look at the consequences then, when we look at emergency admissions, crisis and emergency, look how much of that crisis and emergency is coming from the most and the next most 20% of our population. So all the work that we're doing on and trying to reduce activity in acute sector and so on, A&E and all the problems of discharge, all of those things really need to take into account the extent and the knowledge and understanding about how our population deprivation scores are mapped. Now, we can look at that in more detail, and it sounds a bit technical, but don't worry about that. This is a really important measure that I found more recently, and it actually shows there's three good things. The first thing is it shows emergency admissions that you could prevent by ambulatory care or urgent care. But secondly, you can break it down by cause of admission. What are the issues that are actually causing people to go into crisis? But most important here, you can track it back into the neighbourhood, either this LSOA, lower superadequate area, or ward of residence. And that enables you to look at what's going on in the communities these people are coming from. looks quite technical, but just bear with me. Each of these dots is a ward, and it's all the wards across England. Across the bottom, you've got deprivation score with the most extreme on the right, and on the left, you're looking at a rate of admission that's standardized for age and sex. Three things you can see from this. The first one is that when you look at the slope of this line, as you get to the more deprived end, there are twice as many admissions for emergencies as there are in the least deprived end. So that's important in itself. But then when you look at the most deprived, no, I'm missing a line here, sorry. If you look at the most deprived 20%, which is down this end, you can see there's a real spread. And that enables me to actually look statistically and say, look, these areas here, these wards are so, even for a particular deprivation score, have got so many higher levels of admission to hospital. What's going on there? What's particularly different about those areas? Whereas, oh dear, I've lost some parts of my slide, I'm afraid. Underneath here, you can see the green dots, and these are areas, again, for a given deprivation score, they've got far less admissions than you would expect for that particular score. So what this tells me is that there are things that you can do within your mark of deprivation to say, how do we mitigate the issues? Because these people are doing things that are different, obviously, to these. Now, I can look at how those dots actually distribute across the country, and you can see here by region, over here on the left, here we are, northwest. And you can see that it's got much higher levels of deprived wards than the other regions. And here we've got the red dots, the green dots, and then the blue dots represented there. And you can see how different that is across the regions. But we can then look within that at our STP ICSs Alan was talking about. And here's Cheshire and Merseyside on the left. And you can see it's got far more of those priority wards, the red dot wards, than the other parts of North West. But it's also got far more than any other part of England. Cheshire and Merseyside has got more of these excess admission red dot wards than any other part of England. We can break that down into CCGs and places. We probably think of them now, and you can see the names here. You won't be able to see the names because of the slide size, but I've just put the one here for Wirral where I work, and you can see we've got the names here of the wards that are the priority wards, the ones with the biggest problem. Now we can look below the CCG level as well. So each of these little dots now is, sorry, I've got to move on a bit, is a neighbourhood. It's an area, a community where people are living. And there are different patterns. And I can show you the patterns for all of the different parts of Cheshire and Merseyside. This is a kind of standard one, Warrington. Look, you see, this is the national slope here. And you can see that the communities in Warrington are arranged a lot across there fairly evenly. When you come to Wirral, however, it's a much steeper slope with a more deprived area up here, a lot more priority wards up here. But even down here, in the least deprived parts of Wirral, they've got excessive admission rates over and above the national position. Why is that? What's going on there? And then when we look at Liverpool, the third type, we can actually see that the priority wards here are actually just the tip of the iceberg. And we've actually got this sort of shape with a whole pile of really wards that have got problems for admissions sitting in there. Now, quickly on to what does that tell us we need to do? Well, we know what the admissions are caused by, and there's a list here. They're the normal things. They're chest pain, abdominal pain, and heart failure, cellulitis, and head injury and falls in the elderly, and so on. So we know it's the usual suspects. But when we look at it, it might be difficult for you to see, it is for me on this slide, but what we can see here is if we look at the priority wards, this is again for Wirral, each of those levels, these are the different causes of admission. What you can see is, and this was a light bulb moment for me, they're not just excessive for one or two of these conditions, it's for all of them. Something's going on, which means that whatever happens to you that's challenging you, it turns out to be a crisis or an emergency. So what are we going to do about that? There are three ways in that this measure shows us. The first one is we need to make sure we don't get that unwarranted variation in the services. But secondly, what's going on in the communities from which these people come? And are there particular challenges and or lack of resource or whatever that's going on in those communities that aren't supporting people to prevent them going into crisis? And then thirdly,
Chris, I'm sorry to interrupt. Chris, sorry to interrupt. Yes. Robert here. Just conscious that we may be behind you on the slides. We're still looking at your CCG example slide here.
Can you give me the number of it? Can you see it?
Number 15.
15? My goodness. I'm on 33.
Okay.
Shall I take control back and see if I can get us a lot? Oh, I think we've moved.
So 15 is... Is that 15?
Sorry, Robert, which...
Is this the one you were stuck with?
We were stuck on 15, Chris.
So that's this one, yes?
Example CCG.
Ah, right. Okay, I know where you are. Bear with, as they say. Thank you.
I think there was a mixture of people for whom that was a problem and wasn't, but just to make sure we're all up to speed. Thank you.
So that was the example CCG slide. Yeah. So I showed you 3 examples of slides of CCGs in Cheshire and Moseley that show a different pattern. This is Warrington, shows an even distribution really along the slope. This is the national slope, and you can see it's fairly close and even towards that. If we look at the next one, here, it's a different pattern. This is the Wirral, where you can see it's quite a steep slope, and here you've got quite a lot of those red dot or priority areas. But even down here at the left-hand end, where you've got the least deprived parts of the Wirral, you're even then getting excessive admissions to hospital over and above the national position. And then when you come to Liverpool, you can basically see here that the priority wards are actually just a tip of an iceberg, and you've got this real density of areas with really excessive admissions into hospital. So we moved on just to say what's causing those admissions in the priority wards, and it's the usual suspects: chest pain, respiratory disease, COPD, heart failure, cellulitis and head injuries, and falls in the elderly. And when you actually look at how that splits out across the different priority wards, here's Wirral again, and I'm looking at the priority wards there. Are you keeping up with the slides now, Robert?
Yes, it just varied for different people, but I think most are back on track now. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And so what we were looking at here, this was another light bulb moment where you're saying it's not just 1 or 2 of these problems that actually are excessive admissions from these priority wards. All of them, any of those topics, you're seeing people are coming in crisis and emergency. And the implication is that there are lots of other things, not even just health things, where people's problems emerge as crisis and emergency. They're not being able to get upstream enough to actually prevent or divert those kind of problems. So I was saying there are 3 different ways that we've got to look at this. The first one is we need to make sure that the services, such in this case of primary care, are actually being consistent about the way they're addressing these particular things, and that we're not getting that unwarranted variation. But secondly, we've got the issue about the communities themselves. What is it about those communities that makes them more hazardous, if you like, to actually mean that these people are not getting support before things become crisis or emergency? And then finally, it's a question of how are those communities linking across into the services, and what's the barriers and gaps there? And I was just going to quickly show, if I've still got the time to do this, what I mean by each of those 3 things, if it moves. So the first one, unwarranted service variation, and we've got this is an example of high blood pressure being managed by general practice, and the lines across here are registers in each general practice of people who've got raised blood pressure, and you can see here the orange are people whose blood pressure still isn't controlled. The blues they are, but here they're not controlled. And you can see that there's quite a lot of variation there in the level at which these people are getting brought into safety, if you like. But if you then look at the number of people who should be on that list but aren't there yet, there's an estimate of them, and you can see how much greater that is. A lot of these people just aren't even getting on the scoreboard, as it were, to get the evidence-based medicine coming their way. If we look at the communities then, here let's go back to our community with its deprivation measures here. What we can see here in perhaps the green dot wards, perhaps in particular, all these different components, you'll know a lot of these in your own particular areas, that are actually in there, in the centre of community and supporting the community membership to actually work together with the social capital that you've got from all that and the mutual support that you're getting. And so to what extent is that true of green dot wards as opposed to the red dot wards where perhaps that's missing? And then finally, connection between services and communities. And here you see back to our slide with the seams, and I'm just going to talk about one of them, the service to community one. And what I've seen as I've gone around the country is that, well, this is where people actually live. They've got their networks, their leadership, and so on over here. But on this other side, we've had service integration taking place, trying to bring in primary care, hospital sector, communities, and so on. And although working on integration and taking care closer to home, what I've often seen is there's this space in the middle, and I call that no man's land. And what you see is you get little sorties coming across. You should have little sorties coming across. No, you don't. Curses. Little sorties coming across from each side, but you've still got this sort of barrier or gap in the middle, which is keeping the two apart. Where, as we move on, of course, that's going to be the place of primary care networks with the social care and community health linked in, and what are they going to be doing about being able to look across? What are they going to see when they look across to where no man's land might be? And what they might well find is that actually it's not an empty no man's land at all, but in there is this a whole range of inputs that are coming from other parts of other sectors that may already be well established in there, working well with relationships and respect with communities, and enable them to move on in the positive sort of directions. So all of those three are different ways, and we need to be looking at all of them to make sure that we're doing the most, particularly for those red dot priority wards, which Cheshire and Merseyside has actually got more of than any other parts of the country. In Northwest, including Cheshire and Merseyside, we've now mapped the primary care networks against those priority wards, so we've got those links really established. But the important thing now is recognising what Alan was saying right at the beginning about our movement from the white paper towards the system working. You can see here, sorry, there's supposed to be another one there. We can see here the different layers of the system with the ICS board and body there being moving on towards 2022. We've then got the place-based approaches underneath that, and they've actually re-established the importance of health and wellbeing boards within that white paper. And then finally, at integrated neighbourhood level, where the PCNs are at the various stages of looking across that no man's land or bridging across, that represents the whole system. And I certainly know from what my contacts have been within Cheshire and Merseyside that this system is really coming together with the right moves, the right enthusiasm and organisation. And I think that despite the fact that Cheshire and Merseyside has got quite mountains to climb in relation to those priority wards, I think we're developing the right structures to be able to take it on if we all work together down the system and within place. Thanks very much.
Chris, thank you so much. I'm conscious that you had to race through a huge amount of material in not a huge amount of time. Extraordinarily rich food for thought there, ways of both looking at the data and analysing it. And for those of you who want to tarry with this information, just to remind you, we'll be putting the slides up in a recording after the event so you can go over in more detail what Chris has so skillfully taken us through. So thank you very much again, Chris. And thank you for those in the audience now who are putting in your comments into the chat box, quite a few coming in there, some around housing being fundamental, life chances at birth being such a determinant, about funding shifts and so on. And an interesting one there recently about Northwest being a little bit like East Germany. Perhaps we can come back to that. Conscious of time, so just to remind you all, we're going to take the three speakers one after the other. The first three speakers, so that's Chris, who you've just heard from. We'll go on to Louise Gittins in a second, and then Tony Reeves, and then we'll breathe for a second and have a wider Q&A. Louise, I hope you're there still and online and ready to come on. Louise clearly is the leader of Cheshire West and Cheshire Council. And Louise, you're going to take us through some slides and some thoughts from your perspective and your place. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. And thank you very much, Robert. And thank you, Chris. And luckily, the presentation that I'm going to do will follow on very nicely from Chris's and really shine a light on Cheshire West, which I don't often have a chance to do. So that I'm really pleased to be here today. I have got, I noticed lots of people are having technical challenges. Well, not to be outdone, I am as well. So I can't actually see my slides. So I'm relying very much on Isabel to show them. So hopefully she's going to have the first slide, which has just got my name on it, and the title of my presentation, which is about health inequalities, a Cheshire West and Chester perspective. As well as being leader of the council, I do have responsibility from a cabinet perspective for wellbeing. I kept this when I became leader. I thought it was really important. I'm chair of our amazing Health and Wellbeing Board, and it's glad to see a number of our team from the Health and Wellbeing Board around the table today. So delighted to be here. Next slide, please, Izzy. So what you should be seeing in front of you is a map of Cheshire West and Chester. And what I thought I'd do is to start off with a bit of overview about our life in our place in Cheshire West. So generally, the quality of life is good for many people across the borough, with lower levels of deprivation, higher incomes, and generally good health compared to the national average. However, there are pockets of significant disadvantage where residents experience poorer health outcomes, living conditions, educational attainment, and economic prospect. And on the map in front of you, you can see those areas. So Chris talked about orange and red dots, and here's some of our orange and red dots. So the ones that are red are the 10 most deprived lower super output areas in the country. So we have a number of those in our borough, and the orange dots represent the 20% most deprived areas. Now, if you compared this to, say, Liverpool, it would look very different. But what we've got to realise is that these are in our areas of most densely populated places. So, for example, Chester, the towns of Ellesmere Port, Winsford and Northwich. What isn't shown on here are those hidden areas, and I think Chris was talking about that before. So we've got a very big rural locality within Cheshire West, and hidden within there is significant small pockets of rural poverty. So if we could go on to the next slide, please, Izzy. So let's look at this in a bit more detail. So we've got about 340,000 residents. And when people talk about Cheshire, they think of a lovely, leafy, affluent county with hardly any poverty or health issues. But those dots that we looked at before, let's have a think about what that actually means in terms of numbers of people. So we know that 24,000 of our residents live in the most deprived areas, so within those 10% most deprived areas. And 16 of our lower super output areas fall into that first decile of indices of multiple deprivation. And 2 of these rank in the 2 most deprived areas in England. And 23% of the population are affected by health deprivation and disability, which equates to about 78,000 residents. And I think we talk about dots and percentages, but that's 78,000 people in leafy Cheshire West who are affected by health deprivation. And I think that's something, if we translate that into what's going on in Liverpool and some of the other places, it's an awful lot of people. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. What are our key facts and sort of challenges? Well, we know that these areas of significant deprivation impact greatly on the health and well-being of our residents. We know that within Cheshire West, our inequality gap for life expectancy is about 10.4 years for men and 9.1 years for women. And in some places, this difference can be within half a mile. I live in Neston, and the life expectancy gap between people in Neston and in Parkgate, where Parkgate has got one of the highest life expectancy, is probably about 10 years. So our joint strategic needs assessment tells us statistically that our most deprived areas have a high proportion of children with excess weight. And that's for our reception age kids and for our year 6 children as well. And prevalence of obesity is more than double in reception age children living in our most deprived areas compared to our least deprived areas. And that's about 11% of children in the most deprived and 5.4% in the least. And we know that since about 2009, levels of excess weight have risen in both our most and least deprived areas. However, the increase has been highest in our deprived areas. So that's a real focus on our children. We know that about 7,000 children are eligible for benefit-related free school meals in the borough. But we know there's other children that don't get free school meals that should actually be included in these numbers. And then I talked before about the rural areas and the inequalities that brings in relation to things like access to transport, healthcare provision and digital exclusion. We know that poverty impacts on mental health and with social isolation across the population. And COVID-19 has really shone a light on mental health. We also know that COVID-19, and we talked about this before, has widened the inequalities gap far more broadly. Excuse me, too much talking on chats, I think. And since the pandemic began, unemployment has doubled in Cheshire West and homelessness has increased by 57%. So going forward, what are the impacts on that doubling of unemployment? And we also know there's probably about 15 to 20,000 people that are currently on furlough. So what's going to happen at the end of that? And I suppose for us in Cheshire West, a final challenge is the impact of 10 years of austerity and how that has impacted on our communities with things like reductions in youth services, children's centres and pressures on adult social care. So if we can go on to the next slide, Izzy, please. And this is, I just want to mention Marmot and his reviews that he's been doing. I find his work a complete inspiration, and it's sort of, it keeps me going. And I had the pleasure to introduce him when he came to speak in Chester in 2019. It seems a long time ago now. And that was when he had launched his 10-year review into the first Marmot review. And what was striking in that 10-year review, that the statement that was made in 2010 was actually repeated again and endorsed, and that was that health inequalities are not inevitable and can be significantly reduced. Avoidable health inequalities are unfair, and putting them right is a matter of social justice. There will be those who say that our recommendations cannot be afforded, particularly in the current economic crisis, and we say that it is inaction that cannot be afforded. for the human and economic costs are too high. And that is so true today as it was 11 years ago. He concluded people can expect to spend more of their lives in poor health. Improvements to life expectancy has stalled and declined for the poorest 10% of women, and the health gap has grown between the wealthy and the deprived areas. And importantly, and something that we all know, that place matters. He very quickly did a review into COVID, and I went to the launch of that in January. And in that, he highlighted inequalities and social and economic conditions before the pandemic contributed to the high and unequal death toll from COVID-19, and that the nation's health should be the highest priority for government as we rebuild and recover from COVID, and that health and the economy are strongly linked, and managing the pandemic well will allow the economy to flourish in the long term, which ultimately will support health. And I think it's difficult for us as a system here to disagree with any of those sentiments. And I suppose the challenge for us is how we move forward and build back fairer. Never mind build back better, but how do we build back fairer? So Izzy, if you could go on to the next slide, please. So what are we doing as a council in Cheshire West? Well, we absolutely want to reduce inequalities and achieve better health outcomes for all of our residents. And our aim is to improve our residents' physical and mental health, to promote well-being and to reduce health inequalities. Crucially, our approach focuses on prevention, influencing the wider determinants of health and the role of people and the communities. And these are priorities that run right through the heart of our council plan, our place plan, which is our health and wellbeing plan, and more recently our recovery and renewal plan as we come out of COVID-19. And we're very much taking a whole life approach. COVID-19 has given us all an opportunity to reflect and move into the next phase of the pandemic, one in which normality can resume. But what is that normality? And we have a real opportunity for a reset and an opportunity to make a fundamental change and renewal of the way that society, the council and our economy works, an inclusive economy that works for everyone. COVID-19, for all its challenges and tragedies, has brought people together. Public sector organisations, private sector businesses and many of our communities working together to support the most vulnerable people in our society. And there have been so many fantastic, heartwarming examples of this happening in Cheshire West and Chester and right across the region. I really believe that we can and should harness its ethos and take it forward to build an even better future over the years and months to come. Next slide, please. So what are we doing? Since 2016, poverty has been a key theme in our council. And in 2017, we launched the country's first council-led Poverty Truth Commission. And in October 2020, the council became one of the first in the UK to declare a poverty emergency. And the declaration of a poverty emergency signals that we recognise the seriousness of the range of disproportionate impacts of the COVID crisis on those on low incomes, and that both local and national change is needed. And we're putting the poverty emergency alongside the climate emergency as an equal partner, an equal focus on planet and people. I had hoped to show a clip from our Poverty Truth Commission. We've set up a network of people with lived experience who are our community inspirers. And I'm quite happy to share a link so you can listen to some of their stories. One thing that COVID did was shine a light on food poverty, and I just wanted to highlight some of the work that we've been doing. So we funded a Welcome Network since 2017, which coordinates local communities' efforts to reach those who need our help the most. We have a holiday activity fund, which is designed to support families outside of school term times. And one thing we're doing really hard is the development of that inclusive local economy, one that works for everybody, because we know that poverty is at the heart of health inequalities. So we're doing things like community wealth building, community ownership, promoting the local living wage, promoting social value and corporate responsibility. It's important to improve access to digital skills and digital access, improving our local transport network, supporting affordable housing provision, and many other interventions that we can influence. And finally, my final slide is, how can we do more and work together? I think there's a fantastic opportunity now to build on the crisis and those relationships. Across our sub-region, the local enterprise partnership has got a sustainability and inclusivity
one person
commission,
when I tried to allocate
and
them to a
looking
room
at how
told
we
me,
can
it said, you're disappearing.
work
That's
together to have that people and planet approach to our whole area. Public health is really in the spotlight, which is fantastic. And this is a moment in time when we can make a change. I don't want to go back to that previous normal. Normal was not achieving what we needed it to, and it's not reducing inequalities. We need now to take and grasp all those positives from the pandemic and use this as an opportunity to create a new normal, to work together with a common vision that we can all get on board with, and together we really can make a difference and create that fairer future. Thank you for listening.
Wonderful, Louise. Thank you so much. Again, incredibly rich and stimulating presentation, and to hear things, as it were, from the front line or from the grassroots there is, super helpful for us all. So thank you for that. I'm going to bring in Tony in just a second, Tony Reeves, if you're there, just to tee you up for you to put your camera and microphone on. But just to say, after we've heard some remarks from Tony, I'm going to ask him to be rejoined by Chris Bentley and Louise. And I think just as a teaser, there's one key question for me which is really resonating in the chat coming out. And I think this was from you, is it Karen Bliss, around, well, essentially saying, it's 10 years since Marmot. What's still stopping us? Why haven't we made the changes there? So let me try and pick that up. But first of all, let me come to Tony. Are you there, Tony? Hello, Tony Reeves, are you there? Well, while we're waiting for Tony to join us, let me put those questions actually back to Louise and to Chris. So Louise, if you could actually switch your, Tony is saying he doesn't have control of the mic. Okay, Izzy, if we could give Tony Reeves control of the mic,
yeah,
that would be great. Thank you very much, Izzy. Apologies, Tony. One second, Tony, we'll bring you on. And as I say, after we've heard a few remarks from Tony, we'll bring Louise back and Chris back and be able to pick up one or two comments in the chat function. Quite a few coming in now. There was the one I want to particularly raise about progress since Marmot. And I think that goes back to Alan's point at the beginning, really, about how we move here from analysis to action. There's a huge amount of analysis, maybe a huge amount of agreement on what the problem is, maybe a little bit more divergence. If not exactly in what the solution is, then how to implement that solution, or what the barriers are to that solution and how we might be able to disable them.
I think you can probably hear me now. Can you?
Wonderful, Tony. We can, yeah. Thanks so much for joining, and apologies for the being disabled on the microphone there.
That's perfectly okay. Izzy, if you don't like what I say, you can just disable me again anyway. I'm perfectly relaxed about it. So just building on what the previous speakers have said, perhaps I can talk about some of the practical things we're doing in Liverpool. I won't do a presentation on levels of deprivation, just some headlines though. 50% of our neighbourhoods are in the 10% most deprived in the UK. If you look at healthy life expectancy, the differentials between the most affluent ward in our city and the least affluent ward are 22 years for men, and those two wards are less than a mile apart, which shows you the sort of inequality that we have in our city, and obviously an underlying level of deprivation compared to the UK average as well. So some very, very big challenges. In 2018, our strategic partnership reformed, and I think we had some very frank discussions about what we were facing. And really 40 years on from the Black Report, which is, certainly in my working life, was the first publication that influenced my thinking about tackling health inequality and wider inequalities, but also more than 60 years on from the launch of the welfare state, 70 years actually from the launch of the welfare state, we still had really acute deprivation. And actually, the conclusion that we came to was that we needed to fundamentally change the way we were working, and that silo top-down paternalism from well-meaning professionals wasn't going to change outcomes for people in our more deprived communities. And in a way that can be exemplified. If you look at, we have some world-class health institutions with absolutely great clinicians working within them in the city, and some of the worst health outcomes in the country. And there's a range of things you can look at to see that. If you look at all the great work that goes on from the different agencies around criminal justice, and more than 50% of people reoffend and end up going back inside. Actually, what we're dealing with here is systemic failure to really address the issues in those neighbourhoods. If you look at it through the lens of certain minority groups, the situation gets even worse. And when you look at employment rates, etc., that problem is exacerbated. And in a way, and obviously this is about health and care, this session this afternoon, but if you look at it through a health lens, poor health and health inequality is trapping people in poverty, but it's also contributing massively to low productivity in our economy. And you can turn that round to say that low productivity and poor skills are contributing to poor health. And our view is that you need a joined up approach from across different agencies, where you actually develop a set of shared outcomes that we're focusing on, that all agencies coalesce around. So we deploy public money much more productively, and at the heart of this are local people and communities, and with a genuine desire to empower people to take control of their own lives. And that's about economically empowering people. It's about empowering people to live healthier lives, to make better choices, better education, getting access to better housing, all of the things that previous speakers have talked about that are just incredibly important. Another really big issue for us in Liverpool, and we have to be brutally honest with ourselves here, is that despite some really great progress in terms of the city's regeneration over the last 10 to 15 years, certainly since City of Culture, European City of Culture 2008, the reality is that regeneration has been patchy in its impact. It hasn't done enough to transform life chances for people in our poorer communities, and those pathways into credible pathways into good jobs are as hard to access as they have been over the whole period that I've just been talking about. And so regeneration isn't about bricks and mortar and shiny new buildings in the city centre. I'm not saying that they don't have a role to play, but it is absolutely about creating the conditions for people to succeed and to make sure that none of our neighbourhoods are left behind. One of the final things to say, and I'll talk about what we're doing about this, is that there was insufficient focus on the communities that people lived in, our neighbourhoods. An awful lot of things were service provision was organised through silos, through professional silos, through functional silos, rather than groups of professionals coming together at a place level around their neighbourhoods. And what's really interesting for me as we move forward with the ICS model is how we can create that place-based approach that fits within that overarching framework, but is capable of tackling the issues that we have in our communities. And just looking at this through a health and care lens will just recreate new sorts of silos. We need to look at those wider determinants and do that at as far as possible at a neighbourhood level if we're really going to make a difference. So we developed a city plan that took some time to get going because of the pandemic, but was signed off a few months ago, and we're really mobilising activity against that now. That city plan set out 6 priority areas for us and outcomes around healthier, happier and fairer Liverpool. A key theme about people being better educated to succeed through their lives. People living in safe and thriving neighbourhoods, strong and inclusive economy with a really big focus on inclusive. Economic growth on its own isn't enough. It has to be economic growth that doesn't leave whole communities behind as it has done in the past. A low carbon, connected and accessible city. And of course, because it's Liverpool, the most exciting city in the UK. It's not about creating that, it's just maintaining that, because that's obviously already the case. Those are pretty, familiar themes for you, but those are the driving themes for all of our organisations in the city that are part of our partnership. And in the context of that, the healthier section, for example, our One Liverpool plan for health and social care transformation sits in the midst of that city plan, is a central part of it. And it isn't just about improving health outcomes. As I said earlier, improving health outcomes in a way that drives inclusive economic growth, and the other component parts of the plan contributing to people's ability to live healthier lives. So it's very much about creating a systemic approach to how we take things forward. We're doing far more work at a neighbourhood level. Our desire in time is a real power shift where we devolve a lot more decision making down to neighbourhood level, and don't just consult our communities, but involve our communities in taking decisions about the things that affect their lives in those neighbourhoods, and taking that even a step further in some cases where local people will be the decision maker themselves, not just participating in that. It's about whole population health models. It is about agencies coming together at a local level and being empowered, the staff on the ground being empowered to work with primary care, to work with other key assets in those neighbourhoods, voluntary sector assets, local communities themselves, and build on the strengths that are already there to create very different outcomes. And we genuinely believe as a partnership that unless we do these things radically differently, and not just tick some boxes about reform, then we will have exactly the same conversation. It might not be us, it might be people like us. We'll have exactly the same conversations in 20 or 30 years' time about the same families, the next generations of the same families with exactly the same issues in the same communities. Because ultimately, despite the amount of resource that's gone into a lot of these communities, not so much in the last 10 years with austerity, which has exacerbated the problem, but it can't just be about money, because those problems were there through the years under the last Labour government, where a lot more investment went into those communities. We won't really shift the dial. And that's the challenge that we're facing, that really fundamental rethink of what we're doing. Implicit in this is a different relationship with our communities, but it's not about saying to local people, you need to change your behaviour, everything we're doing is fine. We recognise that we have to change how we think and how we act, and we have to be prepared to empower people, and critically we have to be prepared to come out of our silos and take collective responsibility for getting alongside our communities in a joined up way and assisting them to secure their well-being. And that's the journey that we're on. As we carve carve out the place-based approach under the ICS framework, that's exactly what we'll be doing. But what we won't be doing is just dealing with the health and care. We will have strong neighbourhood management services working at a local level, input from housing, education, skills, etc. All of these things are being mobilised so that we really can focus on well-being and those 6 outcomes I referred to earlier. Challenges are to this, obviously, lack of resources at the present time. How you shift the model to early intervention and prevention when parts of our system are under such acute pressure is a real challenge, but that acute pressure will not get any better unless we can affect that shift. And so we're working really, really hard to find ways to do that. Politics is always an issue. The need to set a long-term direction here and relentlessly pursue the things that we're talking about over the long term to really make a change is very, very important. We're not really going to fundamentally change outcomes for people if the strategy changes every year or every 2 years. We need, whilst of course we can learn and fine tune as we go along, we need to set a long-term direction. And one of the ways we've done that is to make sure that the city plan isn't owned by the council or any individual institution. It's owned and signed off by the governing bodies of all of our key partners and all of the key sectors in the city, including the Chamber of Commerce, the voluntary sector, as well as all the public sector organisations. So we're not saying for a second we've cornered the market on innovation or creative thinking. There's lots of great ideas going on in other places. I'm more familiar in our part of the world with the stuff that's going on in the Liverpool City region. And on a weekly basis, we learn from our colleagues in other places. But we are absolutely clear that unless we're prepared to act radically differently and deploy resource differently, be prepared to deploy resource according to need rather than just per capita across our area, which quite a lot of services have been allocated on that basis in the past, then we're not going to get into the guts of this and really sort these issues out. The final point I'll make is that the key element to this, in my view, is leadership. And it isn't about, of course it involves political leadership, but it's about networked leadership across the system. And it is not the sort of leadership that tries to dominate and give everybody a script, but it's about empowering people. It's about empowering our frontline staff to work together, but it's absolutely empowering people to take control of their own lives and create that shift in the relationship between the local state and local people. And it's in that context that we believe we can start to fundamentally address the equality issues that we're facing in Liverpool, contribute to what's happening on a wider footprint. Cheshire, in our case, it's Liverpool City region, but from a health and care perspective, the Cheshire Merseyside footprint will be willing participants and partners in that journey, but we will unapologetically concentrate really hard as well on getting that joined up place leadership. And Alan and others, obviously the conversations we've had thus far, hopefully this will set the context why getting that place-based stuff right is so important for us if we're going to shift those outcomes in the coming years. So I'll stop there, and I'm very happy to join the discussion.
Thank you very much indeed, Tony. Again, hugely interesting to hear what you're doing there, particularly around the One Liverpool as part of your city plan, and also the degree to which, and this has come up quite a lot in the chat, the degree to which health and economy are so knitted together and need to be so knitted together, actually, as an approach. Now, I'm very conscious of time. We're running beyond where we need to be. We will be going into our breakout rooms very, very shortly. But I'm going to just shorten our plenary here because I think it's important for more people in the room to have as much opportunity to speak with one another as possible. And in order to abbreviate it, I'm going to be very cruel on our speakers. That's Chris Bentley, Louise Gittins and Tony Reeves just now, and really just ask them to say one thing in answer to the big question. And I'm sure you're all going to resist and protest at the question I'm going to ask you. The question is this, and I'm going to come to you in turn. So Chris Bentley first, then Louise Gittins, and then you, Tony, who's just spoken. And picking up again on this point, and I'm going to exaggerate it to make it worse, picking again up on this point, what's different after 10 years since Marmot? If you were going to place a bet, or if you were going to say there's one thing which I really think is going to make the difference here, there's one horse I'm going to back in this race, whether it is, some of you, Chris, you mentioned the seams, Louise, you were talking very much about collaboration, Tony, you were talking about getting out of silos, etc., and so on. But if I really push each of you, and you've only got 30 seconds here because of the time constraint we're now under, what's the horse you're going to back here if we're really going to crack this health inequalities thing? I just want you to say very, very quickly, Chris, what would that be? Louise, what would that be? Tony, what would that be? Where would you put your bet for now? Chris, coming to you first.
I'd be cheeky and I'll say, I've said this before, when asked what one thing I'd like to change, it's the idea that there's one thing that would actually make the change. Right. Because the whole point of today, isn't it, to talk about how we have to do all these things together. It's bringing all the things together, and the very good things that I've been hearing for the last hour or so are making that point for me. We won't do this individually. I don't like it when people say, oh, it's not about healthcare, it's about whatever. It's not, it's both and. Healthcare has got just as much to do, and perhaps even more at the moment with COVID and the long COVID and all the damage that COVID's doing in health, as well as the other social elements. And okay. So I think that we've got to work on the stuff we've been talking about, place-based working, all together, really empowering communities, and then at the moment really lever in the lessons we've learned from COVID, because there are lots of really good things that happened, and we want to not go backwards. And as Louise said, let's build back fairer, but learning immediate lessons, because they're hot. People are prepared to move.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much. So, Louise, my question's rubbish, clearly. We're not going to do just one thing, but do you have a horse you're going to back in all of this, or one thing you'd stress from the many points you made?
Yeah, I think it's believing in our communities and listening to our communities and working together with them. So I think it's those elements around community, and I think Tony said we've got to stop doing things to people, and that's really, really important, and we've got to work together collectively on this and get out of our silos. So I think that's my little summary of, I don't know there's one word to describe that, but there you go.
That's great. Thank you, Louise. And Tony, are you still there? I can't see you on my screen. But is there one thing that you would particularly want to leave us as the message to resonate from what you've said?
I think he's written something down in the chat because he's lost.
Lost sound again.
Sorry.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Okay. Sorry, I just lost sound completely for a second then. So what I just put in the chat.
Yeah.
It can't just be one thing. It has to be systemic. There's a whole range of factors that come together to enable people to take control and really change their well-being. If you pushed me about what the most important policy intervention is, and I'm really sorry to disappoint people, important as health outcomes are, the most important thing is education and raising skill levels, in terms of giving people the tools to take control of their own lives. And actually, health outcomes will flow from that. I'm not saying we ignore health. And as I've said, it can't just be one thing. But the most important thing in terms of enabling people to get out of poverty is about improving skill levels. And at the heart of that is education.
Tony, thank you so much. Tony, Chris and Louise, thank you, all three of you, for very thought-provoking presentations and inputs. Now, we are running a little bit behind. So I'm going to take us now into breakouts, and this is obviously the high anxiety moment from a tech point of view. We've got 9 breakout rooms based on the 9 places from the patch, the Cheshire and Merseyside patch. You've been, according to the way you've registered, you've been allocated a room. Obviously, some people aren't directly aligned with a particular place, so some people have been randomly assigned, as will those who've not registered beforehand. But I'm going to ask Izzy to put people into their breakout rooms. There will be one facilitator per room, and the facilitator will be a member of the partnership executive team. And they, during the course of the breakout, will be feeding back to me live on a WhatsApp channel, and I'll be picking up key points as we go through, and playing that back at the end to Jackie Benny, who's the chief officer of the partnership, to respond to. It's not a whole lot of time, and it's not a whole lot of time to process what's coming out of it, but we keep a record of all of the comments as they're coming out, and again, that'll be available after the event. I think we're going to have approximately 20 minutes, I reckon, for the breakouts, and I'm going to ask Izzy to allocate people to their rooms. You'll go into those breakouts. Your facilitators will take you through the question, and the key question really that you're going to be asking and answering is, how can we best partner in our place to reduce health inequalities? So there you go, into your rooms, and I'll see you back in the plenary in approximately 20 minutes. Welcome back, everybody, to the plenary, to the main room. Just waiting for you to regather. What's one of the joys of facilitating in this format is that when you pull people back from their breakout groups, they don't go and get a coffee or make a phone call. So thank you very much indeed for having a go at this question. And of course, we could spend a much longer time on it. How can we best partner in our place to reduce health inequalities? And I've been looking at the chat that's come through on the WhatsApp group from the 9 places. Of course, there are some comments there that are unique to the individual places, but some which are a bit more general. And I'm going to just pick out a few themes. Clearly, I can't possibly cover everything that's come up there. I'll pick out a few themes and share those. And I'm going to ask Jackie Benny to reflect on those themes. And Jackie, you yourself will have been facilitating one of those groups, so you'll have a bit of a flavour for the sorts of things that were being discussed. You were with the Cheshire West group, I believe. So let me pick out a few themes. And just to say, if you're not Jackie Benny, could you please put your microphone on mute if it's not already? And once Jackie and I have had an exchange about this, we'll move on to our final presentation of the day, which will be Joe Rafferty. So Joe, also to put you on guard, I guess, for the next part of the afternoon. So here are just a few things I picked out, and for the sake of order, I grouped them into 4 areas: connections, communications, contributions, and community. Gone for 4 C's just for the sake of order. Around connections, one of the early comments here was around connecting around objectives. So I think we talked a lot around relationships coming together and partnering in that sense. But here's a kind of there's a management aspect to that, which is shared objectives, bringing the right people together. I heard a few comments about are we including the right people? Are meetings too big, too small? Are they representative enough? And I heard the phrase a couple of times about patient leadership. So are we connecting with people with patients in the right way? And there's a comment later actually about community leaders too. Interesting, quite a few comments there about connecting successfully around the early years and the children's agenda too. And using the health and well-being boards as a kind of vehicle for connecting. So that's a few comments around the connections point. Communications, you'd expect that, wouldn't you, as one of the C's we might talk about. Quite a lot here about whether we have a common understanding and vision, but perhaps just as interesting, I heard the phrase, co-design and co-production a few times, and of course using technology around that in particular to bring people together, and using that to feedback effectively. Perhaps the biggest of these categories is around contributions. Contributions, I guess, covers obviously resourcing and money and budgets. And I guess the feeling I get is whether there's insufficient flexibility around some of those budgets. And a few of the speakers, I think, have already mentioned it's not necessarily about money per se. Some of this is more about the intelligent use of money and directing of it and flexibility around it. and actually several comments around building on existing good practice and reinventing the same things. Again, not reinventing the same things. And I guess, again, the larger point here, you know, Tony, you said this, I believe, in your comments. I heard you, Lisa, talking about Marmot, and indeed Chris earlier. We kind of have all the answers here. It's not really about going back. It's starting from where we are and focusing more precisely, harnessing where we are. And then finally, on this community point, clearly, you know, reaching out, involving others, you know, education in the community was absolutely key. Heard the word, if I had an E and it fitted into my list of C's, I would have put education. And again, Tony was very clear on that in his sort of parting shot after his contribution, and changing the way we engage with the community so that we let go of it. Quite an interesting sub-theme in all of this around leadership coming not necessarily from a kind of traditional top-down structure, but more from bottom up, more devolved, if you like, more deregulated, more collective. And there's a final theme, and again, this is to tee up Joe Rafferty before I just ask Jackie to respect, and that's quite a lot of comments around how the intelligent use of data can be our, if not our savior exactly, then a really fundamental next step in the way we tackle some of these things as we get more precise and more active and more real time about using the kind of information we have. So Jackie, I don't know what you make of those themes. Again, they're just quickly picked out of the chat as I was monitoring it on the WhatsApp group. As I say, you were in your own group there. Anything you particularly want to reflect on there and what you've heard from what I've said?
I mean, it's heartening, isn't it, to hear those reflections from, or the feedback from those groups, and certainly I heard much of the same in the group that I was with, as you said. A lot of this does need to happen at place, of course, doesn't it? And I think it's really good to hear that people are on that journey already in terms of making those connections, a common vision, developing their ways of working. And one of the things you didn't pull out there, but was said in my group, which I couldn't agree more, is simplifying governance, just simplifying things so it's easy to connect, and being brave about resourcing and pooling resources to make that collaborative effort really work for our local people. And I think that, you know, the themes around education and listening to our communities, getting into our communities, leveraging the voluntary sector's contribution, I think also to enable voices to be heard of and voices of the people who are suffering the inequalities are really important partners equally on this journey. But I guess this all can only be done in neighbourhoods and coalesced at place. Certainly in my group, and it sounds like from the other groups, that people had already got behind their health and wellbeing boards, health and wellbeing strategies as a recognised place where they can start to acknowledge, understand, and ultimately address the needs in the community. So really, I think, you know, all the ingredients are there, and all of that feedback would be my main reflection. We need to reflect on how we best support that, and there will be some support we can bring to that, whether it's partnering with colleagues around data and information and resources. But there is an important part about resources and getting resources into the right places based on need as a future direction of travel for the ICS. And
when you say we there, Jackie, that's you saying we, the partnership executive, as supporting the partnership. Is that correct? Or
yeah, most definitely. I mean, I think we are the servants of the places in terms of what they need. So where things are difficult well, they won't be difficult to engage, because the engagement needs to happen obviously at a community level. But where we can support, whether that is cross-fertilizing ideas, being a provider of data and information, programs of work that would be best focused on various groups of work. The programs of work that we have been important, but there are many more programs of work that we need to get into that our places will tell us is much needed around population health in particular. So I think that is our job as the executive, to support that direction of travel. But it's to get behind each of our places as they go on this journey forward, which sounds like people are.
Yeah, no, it does sound like people are, and again, that obviously we put people into place-based groups more or less, and there was that sense of working at that level, making sense for people and being manageable for people. You know, it's not too high to be general, not too low to be kind of lost in the weeds. So it sounds like a quite a productive, sort of strategic enough level for people to work at. And yeah, and just to support your point there about the kind of listening involved in all of this and how critical that is, because there are so many voices that are kind of ready to be heard and kind of fed in to that kind of wider strategic effort. So thank you very much, Jackie. That's really helpful to have that reflection. And as I said earlier, you know, there's clearly lots that came out in those breakout groups, and this is only a very kind of brief summary and reflection on them. We will be going back over those comments and kind of organizing them, reflecting on them, and then doing a proper feedback for participants today so that they can go over those in their own time, along with the recording of the event and the slides that go with them. But thank you everybody to everybody who participated in those 9 groups and the facilitators. Very much appreciated. It's time now for us to move on then to our last agenda item of the day. And I'm going to invite Joe Rafferty to talk to us. Joe is the Chief Executive of Merseycare NHS Foundation Trust. And I trailed this a little bit earlier because it came out of the groups, just how important the kind of smart use of data will be going forward. And I suppose, you know, I asked an overly crude question, didn't I, earlier of our 3 participants about what's going to make the big difference here. And clearly, you know, data is going to be part of that. And I think one of the reasons we were so keen and are so delighted to have Joe participate today is that the work he's doing, the project he's doing, is really moving on that work around data collection, data analysis, not just for the sake of academic reflection, although of course that is very useful long term, but also for short term and indeed real time adjustments to clinical care in the community. So Joe, if you are there, I'm going to ask Izzy to make sure you are unmuted and that we can see you on the camera as well. And we'll go to your slides, which I believe Izzy is going to operate for you. So Joe, if you're there, let me invite you onto the virtual stage.
Thanks, Robert. Can you hear me?
Hear you perfectly, yes.
Okay, brilliant. Izzy, if we could have the first slide. Thanks very much for the invitation today. It's been a very interesting conversation to be part of. It struck me how everybody very much had coalesced around the real intention to shift health inequalities, but almost we could maybe conclude as a hypothesis that our systems are perfectly designed to ensure that we drive into silo behaviors and thinking, and therefore we end up with a very fragmented approach to our endeavors around tackling health inequalities, and in a way that's what I want to talk about today. I mean, if you look, I want to talk about an approach called the System P Collaborative. It's using data analytics to move us to a sort of different set of insights, really. And if you look at it's called System P because it's obvious there. You can see I'm highlighting lots of words that start with P, but which have featured pretty heavily, actually, either directly or indirectly in lots of the conversation today. And I suppose the System P Cooperative really says, let's not treat these as individual silos. Actually, prevention should not be a completely separate conversation from what happens in terms of precise patient care. But often our systems fragment us into 2 separate conversations. So the notion is to create combined intelligence from the use of the System P Collaborative. If I could have the next slide, please, Izzy. The reason it's important is, I think, summed up in the quote. However good we research things, we can't really escape from the dilemma that all of our knowledge is generally speaking about the past, and all of our decisions are in the future. So if we can, it struck me, you know, thinking about particularly Marmot, we have a vast array of knowledge, largely pulled from history, to sort of describe the current position for many groups and populations, but something makes us stumble in terms of using that data to create new insights, and therefore to move us forward into taking actions. And what we are proposing through the System P Collaborative is to, our co-op is to work out ways to get more real-time information and to use that information in a way that generates new insights, not just a cloud of more data, but new insights, and then use those insights to actively generate decisions in close to real time that will allow us to begin to change our services in a sort of way where we can monitor really significant changes to any of the Ps, and indeed the collective set of Ps that we've talked about. Could I have the next slide, please, Izzy? And where we are in Cheshire and Mersey, I think at the minute, is in a position to build a platform of intelligence-led health policy, but probably critically multi-agency approaches to effectively begin to manage healthcare differently. If you could just click 3 times, please, Izzy, I think it will animate this up. We're doing a great job with shared data. I will talk about an approach called CIFA in a minute, but as a response to the pandemic, we have collected data differently and used it differently, and we shouldn't lose the opportunity that that presents us. But actually, having a lot of data is really interesting, but it doesn't necessarily drive us any faster towards better decisions. And I think what we have begun to appreciate through some of the COVID response has been that shared analytics is really, really critical to get us to the sort of next base in this mountain that we have to climb, if we go for that metaphor. And the proposition is that the System P Cooperative is an approach where we need to think about sharing our really scarce capabilities, particularly around collection of data and analytics. But if we do that, it will move us to a shared strategy for Cheshire and Merseyside, but not just for Cheshire and Merseyside, because if you think about, and I'll talk about in a minute how we do this, that shared data and analytics arises up right from people in their communities, in their places and so on, but starts to give us insights that we previously haven't had. Next slide, please. And I'll not spend a long time on this because, I think we've got a sense around what population health management can do. But I think another reason for the System P Cooperative is we've got some brilliant narrative and vocabulary around population health management. But the question is, do we know how to change those insights into decisions that are going to change care and payment systems? Because if we don't change the care and payment systems, then chances are we will continue to describe the situation we're in ever more clearly, but not actually create the change that we need to see. There's plenty of examples there. I just point to the second bullet point down, where we need to think about the delivery of proactive and preventive care as opposed to episodic care. COVID has actually taught us that. We ended up with lots and lots and lots of people in hospital who were very, very seriously ill, because actually that's where we had invested most of our resources, was in the treatment system and in an episodic treatment system. Now, NHS did a brilliant job in doing all of that stuff, but we could have begun to invest in communities and community activism around health and care differently in general practice and in social care, differently in remote monitoring and so on, which could have changed the distribution of demand through COVID. And that might have made it a very different experience. So it's just worth, before we all start to forget COVID, that actually it was a real example of how we need to do population health management, not just bits of episodic care, be it social or healthcare. Next slide, please. So the approach to a joined up population health approach that this cooperative could produce is based on better data, flow and integrating all data necessary to understand what happens around someone's life, to build our analytics in a less than two-dimensional way. So not a straight line or a slightly wavy line on a graph, but to begin to think about what we can do with the new science of predictive analytics, so that we can begin to use all of the data we generate to create new insights that give us a sense of what the future might look like. So we start to create a shorter span of time between our data and our future decisions, if you remember that second quote. And of course, then to think about how we use that to optimize our care processes. And by care, I mean, in the broadest sense, that will include self-care, home care, all of those sorts of things. And none of that really works unless we reform our payment mechanisms. I was struck by Paul Cummings' quote that all councils have lost 50% of their income over the past 10 years. And that alone is a reason that we need to think about changing payment mechanisms. Next slide, please. So if this sounds sort of theoretical, actually, the first point is to show you this sort of what looks like a complicated slide, but some of you will have heard the phrase CIPFA, but CIPFA is an approach that we stood up in Cheshire and Merseyside in response to the pandemic. We realized at a very early stage, actually, that we had, again, lots of data, but not much insight on what was happening with COVID. CIPFA stands for Combined Intelligence for Population Health Action. That's really important because, you know, we do want to say on the tin what we mean. We do lots of silo-based intelligence work. And actually the core of this is to say we want to combine intelligence. We want to look at as many bits of data and information as possible. We want to see our populations differently, and our population isn't just the group that lives inside a boundary. Population is, of course, any group of individuals that have something in common. And the critical thing is that we want to use this combined intelligence to deliver a new set of actions. And one of the things I'd like to say to the system is thank you very much for having us connect a data platform together that we've now loaded information data from over 2,000 systems across Cheshire and Mersey. So you see all of our acute hospitals, all of our local authorities through social care, primary care, community, mental health out of ours, and all sorts of other systems. Because we've had the will and energy to do this, we're one of the few systems anywhere in the country that can readily access our vaccination data now in a really interesting way. And also we were able to stand up across much of the region the smart testing approach, because we could access through this system the laboratory tests. The critical thing about this is we're able to update this information every day. Sometimes we're able to update the information actually, you know, many times a day. So the System P notion is to suggest that given that we've got this amazing asset now, why don't we begin to think about collectively as a cooperative, beginning to build more and better data into it, new style analytics out of it based on predictive analytics, and then use that to begin to shape our care and payment processes. Next slide, please. Just to give you a feel for the actionable insights that might be generated. I think today this goes live. This is vaccination data for Cheshire and Merseyside. You can cut this data in any number of ways. We can look at it just on an NHS footprint basis. This happens to be the local authority breakdown. And it shows the breakdown for Knowsley. We didn't pick on Knowsley specifically. It just happened to be the one that we were using. But what you can begin to see is the population size, the vaccinated population, the unvaccinated population, who's had first dose, who'll have second dose. You can see the breakdown here by ward level. So you're really able to get down into very sort of important community groups. Of course, the real power of this then is not just to say who's vaccinated, but to begin to say, well, who's vaccinated, but who is also keeps getting tested. So that may be an indication that vaccination isn't working in that population group for some reason. We can look at who's been admitted post vaccination. So we begin to look at the efficacy of the vaccination process. We can look at ethnicity. We can look at other underpinning health conditions. We can start to put triggers on this to say, well, actually, we know the 5 characteristics of people who are most susceptible to COVID, and we can begin to put triggers in that give us new insights and new intelligence to do different things. Of course, this is a COVID and a vaccination piece, but we could be doing this sort of approach with any set of circumstances we choose to look at, and I'll show a little bit of that as we go. The other thing is this is updated twice a day from the National Immunisation Management Service. So you can be looking at the real changes in vaccination at a ward level and beginning actually the next day to change your vaccination policy. That's what happened actually around most of the smart testing approach that we undertook in across a lot of Cheshire and Merseyside. So this is a way of beginning to use population health management new insights to make real-time decisions that affect the quality of care and potential outcomes for people, not in years, but in literally in days and weeks as we go. Next slide, please. More generally, the organization of the CIPFA platform, I think, offers us a remarkable opportunity to bring alive the whole notion of what we mean by population health management, and to begin to really significantly, I think, erode health inequalities, not only across the system, but however we choose, I suppose, to define the system. So we can create an integrated platform for CIPFA at an ICS level, but really critically, that is fed from place-based data sources. And those place-based data sources can be really local. But the point is that those can be aggregated up at any level we choose to. We can then also use information from providers, so not just NHS providers, but any provider in the system where we can agree the information flow. But to think about integrated care records, and really critically, the next phase of what we'd like to do is think about personal health records or personal health and care records. So this is person-entered data. This is daily trackers. It's lots of the stuff that we know that will ultimately shift the belief, the reliance on institutions and institutional models into direct sort of person power empowerment and all of those types of things. So we have an opportunity here. We have this phrase system by default. And I think this is a really good way to begin to think about our describing the system by default. Sometimes the system might be totally the ICS. If, for example, we wanted to know what was happening with the use, let's say, of particular types of imaging services in radiology departments, and you want to get a general view. But equally, we may well want to know exactly, how much knife crime there is in a particular locality, and how much and how often that relates to the instances of substance abuse. So there's many ways we can cut this, and the opportunity here is it gives us a very powerful, transformative, empowering sort of approach, where the population can be literally a very small group in a very described place, or it can be the entirety of the ICS. And for some research purposes, we can, of course, use this approach to channel our information into bigger pools to really begin to look at the big epidemiological types of approaches we need if we are going to, erode health inequalities on a sustainable basis. So last few slides, the next one, please. I'm not going to talk through this in great detail. It's a takeaway slide in a way, but there is a real opportunity here, if you think by 23, 24, to have sort of comprehensive transformational data in place, system-wide intelligence-led approaches to improve our outcomes, because actually we won't improve anything if we don't know what we're trying to improve. It's an old adage, but it's true. Measurable impacts that we can look at in much more real time. And we can then have used this to think about integrated payment systems to move forward. Next slide probably describes a little bit of the core benefits of this. This is some data we've picked out of Liverpool where we've done a bit of work around this, but it's people with a complex life. You can see in the middle, that's people with one major health issue, physical health issue, one major mental health issue, and at least one of 7 other criteria: homelessness, domestic abuse, substance abuse, persistent worklessness, and so on. And you can see that for 3,500 people, if you add the sort of main core numbers up, and this is just mental health, community health, and acute care, so it's only the top end of the health service, people with complex lives are using on average 10 contacts in these complex services every year. You know, our opportunity here is to think about this really differently. Now, what's not in there is primary care, social care, police, education, housing, employment, all of the things that have featured so heavily today. But actually, the SAIFA system gives us an opportunity to connect those in. So this could become a really stellar opportunity to think and understand about this group of people, just as an example, very differently. Which, if I just take the next slide, just as a, you know, if we look at that group in Liverpool, we spend about £87 million per annum to support 3,500 people with complex lives. And to sort of go back to the point again, you know, we do that because we have multiple agencies institutionally pushing themselves into people's lives, who we really need to think about it differently. We need to see their perspective on life, and we need to think about a much more integrated, much more slick, much more thoughtful, intelligence-led approach to what we can do. So I think Tony talked about, you know, the need to get meaningful integration. And I think this starts to point us towards the meaningful integration piece. And whether it's your Liverpool pound or wherever your pound resides actually in Cheshire and Merseyside, we can't keep walking past these opportunities. So we need this sort of analytics, and then we need the real-time basis of this so that we can begin in real time to show to everybody who has got a governance and accountability point in changing these sorts of mechanisms, that actually the changes we're making, the risks we're taking, are beginning to pay off. We can't wait 20 years to see the benefit. Next slide, please. We can push by that one, and I'll just go on to the last slide. So really, it's that's I suppose it's a pitch in a sense for the System P cooperative. We have built this out and through the COVID response, but it's not COVID specific. It gives us a brilliant opportunity, I think, to integrate our civic data in a totally different way. We've done it really responsibly. With SAIFA, we've taken information governance as sacrosanct. So this isn't about giving away people's information. This isn't eroding their legitimate freedoms, their information freedoms, and so on. This is very carefully and thoughtfully managed, I have to say. But it presents us with a very significant opportunity to accelerate our way forward against health inequalities. There are some organisations on the bottom there who've already started, who've been involved in the SAIFA programme early on, who want to do more of this. But I suppose it's my pitch to you to say, if you're interested in taking some of this forward, we'd love to hear from you. So thanks very much for listening.
Joe, thank you so much. I don't know if while you were presenting you had an opportunity to look at all at the chat function. I hope you might have an opportunity now, because there's some fantastically supportive comments that have come in there, really encouraging to the kind of approach you're taking and how significant a set of developments it seems to be that you're undertaking there, and maybe some potential partners who would like to answer that call and contribute or get involved in some way or another. But yeah, it seems you've really struck a chord with people there, Joe. So thank you very much indeed, and for work that to my untrained eyes and ears seems radical and innovative and really a sign of the way forward for many of us and for the partnership in particular. So thank you again, Joe. Thanks for that fantastic contribution. I'm conscious we said we'd let you leave by 4:30, and it's a long afternoon for us, so I won't keep you longer than we'd said. I'm just going to quickly, very quickly, do a recap of some of the things we've covered, and then I'll bring back Alan Yates, the chair of the partnership, just to offer some closing remarks and thank you all. So our focus for today has been on health inequalities. That represents a build or a narrowing in, perhaps, on the theme of the first partnership assembly back in the autumn, which was on places. And this has been about, so how in places can we reduce this ongoing worry in the system, this ongoing problem we've had since Marmot and long before, of course, of health inequalities. We heard from Chris Bentley, Professor Chris Bentley, particularly around this sort of integrated approach, and you heard him push back on me for my facile question about what's one answer here. He said very much it's all of these things working together. We have to be systemic, and maybe systemic is the key word to pull out of today. Louise, we heard from you in terms of the work you're doing in Cheshire West and Cheshire, engaging with people, deriving solutions through that kind of community focus. Tony, I don't know if you're still on the line, but we obviously heard about your city plan in Liverpool, and certainly resonating still for me, and I'm sure with others, was your theme of education at the end, which was then picked up in the groups. And in those groups, we heard of those themes, and there were plenty more, of course, around connection, communications, contributions, and community. And of course, now with Joe's amazing work on predictive analytics and how they may be the future of presumably not just health inequalities, but all sorts of intractable and indeed systemic issues facing us at the moment. So thank you very much to our speakers. I will hand back to you, Alan, then to close things down, thank people and offer your final reflections. And I'll just type in the chat box here a link to the partnership microsite for you to pick up further info. So over to you, Alan. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert, and thanks to Joe, Louise, Chris and Tony for their contributions, but thanks to everybody for the contributions in the groups and the chat and so on. One of the things that illustrates is the ICS isn't them, it's us. I think, and therefore we don't need to get into what have the Romans ever done to us, done for us sort of conversation. We need to get into what are we doing collectively that makes a difference to that. And as Jackie said in answer to Robert's question, the ICS fundamentally is the servant of the system. It's the way of enabling things to be supported and to flourish. And I said at the outset that we were in a year of transition. And I think one of the things we have to do in this year of transition is bake into our ways of working, our priorities, where we're determined to have effect, where we're measuring that we're making progress, and so on. We need to bake all of that into the arrangements over the coming 12 months as we make that transition. So as we move from STP to ICS Mark 1 and then to ICS Mark 2, we need to build all of the things we've been discussing today into it. Been a strong view and an appropriate and supported view. That's what we spent the last partnership assembly talking about place-based being the fundamental, and those places then moving into the detail of their populations and individuals, and in particular communities, recognizing the move from organizations, citadels, barriers, being seen in a different way and being contributors to a whole. And in particular that move and the recognition that sometimes we're not going to be able to be involved because there'll be too many players, and we have to trust others to be involved and be ethical and proper about those sorts of issues. That duty to collaborate and extending that duty to collaborate from just some statutory organisations collaborating to us all collaborating in different ways. And although there are some statutory and formal partners of this partnership, we are all partners, and we are intended to align behind our priorities. And as I said at the outset, this meeting was designed around helping us align. I think a lot of people have described the importance of the agenda around inequalities, and I hope we found it innovating and supportive and encouraging to be able to go on and do that work. And then Joe finally has told us about how analysis leads to actions. You know, the last word in the SIPFA acronym is action, and the purpose of those data and our understanding of them is to provoke action, and not so much on the basis of a long history, but very up-to-date current information. So one of the privileges of being around these parts of the world is there's a great cultural life, I think. And about 15 years ago, I was at the Liverpool Metropolitan Cathedral listening to Lech Walesa, the shipyard worker who led the Solidarity movement in Poland. And he asked a question that is well understood and well known, but I think it applies to us at this particular point. And I'll end with what he said when he was asked why he did it, a humble shipyard worker. He asked the question, if not this, then what? If not us, then who? If not now, then when? And I think that applies to us. I think we are the people that are going to move this agenda. Thank you so much for being involved in it. And I look forward to working with you as we develop this agenda and make progress. Thank you very much indeed.